Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Sober Spartan Podcast. I've got a real treat for you. I've got Philip Sessions on with us, and we're going to be talking about all things personal development, that kind of thing. He's not a person who drinks as well, but he didn't necessarily have a problem with it. But I kind of want to just pass it over to you. Do you want to just tell everyone a little bit about yourself and like who you are, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, Andrew, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I am honored to be on here. I know we talked offline a little bit like, hey, I've never dealt with drinking problems, if you will, or anything, but I've had the other end of that spectrum because when I was in college, my freshman year, I did drink. I'd get drunk and go to the parties, stuff like that. So I'd done it before, but always when I tell people I don't drink, and for me, it's also I don't enjoy drinking. I never did, and I did. I had bad thoughts when I did do the drinking, but then also from a religious perspective, that's something as well why I don't do it. But also I just don't like it. But it's funny, and I wanted to share this with those that are going through sobriety right now. I feel like there is a level of respect when somebody asks if you drink, and you're like, "Oh no, I'm sober, and I've been sober for however long." People have a respect for that. But somebody such as myself who has drunk that chooses not to, but they didn't necessarily deal with alcoholism or anything like that, they always start to question. So it's always like, "Oh, do you drink? No. Why not?" And "Yeah, I just don't like it," or whatever answer I give. And then they'll
Yeah.
say, "Well, have you ever drunk before?" And it's like all these questions that kind of get added up, which is just so weird. And I do feel like the culture is starting to shift now. It's being more
Mhm.
recognized that not drinking is actually almost the cooler thing or more respectful thing overall.
Yeah.
But I just want to share that real quick because I thought it was interesting and would be a different perspective for those that maybe are dealing with sobriety or they're going through that journey right now, which I commend those of you that are doing that. It's incredibly hard for me. Chocolate cake is the thing that I struggle with.
Yeah.
Obviously completely different, but still there's a struggle there for all of us. And so I commend you, those that are going through that sobriety journey right now. And I just want to give you that insight that whether you're going through sobriety or not, there are still people that will always question you on that journey of not drinking, whether you had the problems with it, whether you just decided by choice that, hey, I drunk for like the last 10 years of my life and I'm just not going to drink anymore. Whatever your reason is, people are always going to question you. So just keep going because you're just going to get questioned and looked at kind of funny. But I think the culture is changing to really respect more people that don't drink rather than looking down on them or thinking they're weird or some kind of prude or something like that
Yeah.
because they don't drink.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I see that a lot too. It's like, if you think about it, alcohol is a poison, right? And I'm not going to point the finger and say you're a bad person if you like to partake. That's completely fine. I just know a lot of people that also, they don't have alcoholism. They don't have a problem. They can go out and just have that one drink, whatever. But they do have those moments where they go out and they overindulge. And then they wake up the next day and then they're not operating at full capacity, right? So that's something that I've kind of saw with people, and it's so normalized in culture, everything like that. I mean, there's around where I live here in Canada, there's like liquor stores all over the place in our little town, right? And then you go into more populated areas, you can't walk down the street without seeing multiple um, places that sell alcohol, right?
Yeah.
So, but I'm definitely seeing a big shift, especially with like all those alternatives to booze, like the non-alcoholic stuff, all that kind of thing. And then like people are kind of like realizing like, hey, I feel much better without drinking it, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, so pretty much what the way I equate like people who have an addiction or a problem like that, and this is like kind of my thoughts on it, is like you don't just stop drinking, then everything gets perfect, right? It's like you have to develop as a person. So that's kind of why I want to talk about personal development. And so for me, personal development, when you're thinking about it, it basically starts with three pillars that I find like to make your body feel the best. So that's sleep, diet, and exercise in that order. But what are your thoughts on that? Like, what kind of things do you do to optimize your sleep or to eat the stuff that fuels your body and moving your body? Like, what's your kind of thoughts on that?
So for me right now, And it's probably a little bit of an excuse, but I feel like I'm not the best one to ask this question about because I've got 2 kids under 3, so
Mhm.
sometimes eating goes a little out the window because they want Chick-fil-A or they want this, that, and the other, and it's very tempting. I really try to get, a salad or not eat so many fries and stuff like that, but I'm definitely not the best on that. Although I do know that that's not the optimal thing for me. And the same thing with building a business, with having the kids, having a full-time job and everything. The sleep
Mhm.
is not the best either. But actually here lately I have been trying to get myself in bed by 9:30 because I found that it is helpful for me to get better sleep because then I wake up less groggy. I get up or try to get up at 3:30. I've been getting better because I've been going to bed by 9:30 now that I'm getting up at 3:30 instead of 3:45 or almost 4 o'clock because I decide to hit that snooze button and everything, or sometimes I don't even realize I hit it and I'm still sleeping and everything. But I've noticed that just even in this last week of starting the sleep pattern, that's helped me be able to get up and be more energized for the whole day and everything. And then, of course, as I eat better, I feel better overall. I feel more confident in myself because my clothes fit better and everything. So there's definitely a lot of benefits to that. For me, more of where my self development has came in right now, what I've really been more focused on is learning about sales, about communication, teamwork, leadership, things like that. Through books, audio and actual paperback books, as well as podcasts that I listen to, and then listening to updates from people that I respect in the business industry that are also talking about politics. So Andy Frisella being one of those.
Mhm.
I'm blanking on his name right now. Valuetainment. I cannot think of his name. He's a Middle Eastern
Patrick
guy.
Bet David.
Yeah, Patrick Bet David. Yeah. So those are the 2 guys I like to listen to because they give good business advice, but they also talk about some political stuff. So really keeping up with the news and politics and everything to really help me be able to lead my life and my family. But that's a lot of where my self-development, I guess, if you will, like training comes into play. And then also just actually taking action on that. That's the biggest thing that I've been guilty of. And I know plenty of other people are guilty of is they'll consume, 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 and they never actually take action. And that's where I have learned the most is through taking that action rather than just the consumption of knowledge.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And like thinking back to when I first started my personal development journey, I think we all kind of by default, as we're growing up, we develop as people. But I think like for me, and I don't know if this is for everyone, but I wasn't really consciously aware that's what I was doing. I was just living my life day to day, like so I didn't have conscious awareness around that. But for you, like when were you consciously aware that hey, like I'm developing as a person, and then you start were more intentional about it?
Kind of like you, when I was in like high school and stuff, I didn't necessarily think about it as self-development. And I graduated in 2009 from high school. And back then we didn't really talk about it as self-development necessarily, or it's not the same as it was now. But I really realized that I was not the talkative person. I was the shy guy. I wanted to be more confident in myself. I wanted to be more, really more popular at the end of the day, have the attention of females and everything. And so I started trying to think about the things that I needed to do to change that. And really, when I went to college, is where a lot of that started to change. I did cross country and track, so I was always kind of muscular, but I didn't really lift weights until I went to college. And that's where that changed for me. So I started lifting weights. I started eating healthier because I could control it then. And I had my own money, if you will, instead of being under my parents' roof. And thankfully, my mom would cook meals and stuff like that. But it was whatever she wanted to cook, not what I wanted necessarily. And so I could start controlling these things. And that's where I really started to develop myself, is when I was like, okay, who do I want to be? And I started picturing who I wanted to be and going further in life, going to business conferences, being a part of the RSA Syndicate, being a part of Apex, being a part of other masterminds is where I continue to develop and see new people and where they were at in life, and picking and choosing those areas that I'm like, oh, I like this, the way they do this. I want to emulate some of that. And I would pick and choose these examples of people that I had and start to take action towards that and figure out, okay, what is that piece that I'm missing to be like them? And so on the business front, for me, that's really a sales portion. Like I've gotten pretty good at communication, pretty good at leadership. I was starting to build a team and everything. But the sales side, I know that I need to get better at that. I know I need to get better at lead gen. So I'm really looking for ways to market myself better, to be able to get better at the lead gen, to bring in more leads, to be able to have better sales conversation. Because as an engineer, I tend to just be like, oh, here's the data, facts and figures. And I don't really have that full conversation and really understand where the person's coming from completely, or that's not my natural tendency. So constantly just trying to learn and implement and take action to be able to do that. And so really it's just about finding a target and then going after that target. So finding some kind of example is really how I've kind of built that self-development journey for myself and created that target.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. And like, I used to be the kind of person who was like an ultra consumer, right?
Yeah.
And along my journey, I found out that, just because you heard something doesn't mean it's going to change your life, right? When the actual change happens is when you hear something and then you actually put it into action. So, I guess my question for you is, did you go through a part of your journey where you're the same kind of way? You're just consuming instead of like actually taking action on the things you were learning?
Oh yeah. I mean, one of those things was actually a podcast, not this mic. I actually just switched out to this mic a couple of months ago, but I had bought a mic for my podcast, no, I didn't have a webcam at the time, but I had a microphone and the idea of starting a podcast. And it took me 2 years before I started it. And so it was just this idea. I wanted to do it, but I never took action on it. And actually, I'm kind of in that almost in that frame right now with reading books. Like, okay, I need to be able to spend some more time actually taking some action on these things that I've read. And I've got a lot of notes and several books recently that I read. And I've actually been debating with myself, do I want to pause reading for a little bit and actually take some more action on these things? Because I'm a slow reader. So reading 10 pages a day takes me probably about 20 to 30 minutes. And while that's not a lot of time, it's like, would this help me? Would this be beneficial for me to do that and just really taking more action instead of continuing to consume, especially with my limited time with the kids and everything like that? But yeah, I've been there plenty of times where I've just over consumed or not taken action on the things that I did consume and everything. And it's a vicious cycle and it's hard to do because it's comfortable. It's easy to feel like you've done something. I mean, to finish another book. Oh, cool. I finished another book. Hey, I finished 4 books this month. That's an awesome feeling. And accomplishing something, finishing something is a great feeling, especially for us men. We want to check things off. We want to finish things, but it doesn't help you actually move the needle forward. And so what I've done is, and you talked about it offline, I'm going to write that down. I'm going to put it on a list. I've started actually putting like tasks together for me, like having a task list. Here's my daily stuff. Here's what I'm going to do over the week. Here's a short-term goal, some long-term stuff that I want to do, and just really allowing myself to start checking those things off. Because as you're building something big, it's hard to stay motivated for that. It's hard to continue to do it because a book's easy. You can see from beginning to end. I was at the beginning, I'm making progress through it, I'm almost at the end. Oh, I'm finished with it. When you're building a business, there's not really there's a beginning, obviously, but there's not really an end. And a lot of times, especially at the beginning, you don't feel like you feel like you're still at the beginning because things aren't happening. There's no traction. You talk to somebody and then it's another couple weeks before you talk to somebody else, or there's some interest, and then sometimes posts blow up, sometimes they don't. And there's all these things without an indication that you're going in the right direction. So really breaking down what are some targets that I want to hit along the way as I build this business has helped me be able to stay motivated to continue to go and continue to improve myself as well as my business.
Okay. And something came up there. Like you said that you actually take your time with things, like you're saying you're a slow reader or whatever, but you're spending more time with books. And that's something that I kind of came to the realization. I actually made a post yesterday. I got a couple new books to my library, but then I made the post about like, I used to be the kind of person who just powered through these books and like thought I was Mr. Joe Cool, right? But then I realized that like, okay, I read all these books, but then when I go think back, somebody asked me like, okay, what'd you learn from the book? And then I was blank because I didn't know, because I didn't actually um, put into action. So another idea around reading books for me is because I'm a super stubborn person, right? So like
Mm.
you were saying, especially being men, stuff like that, we want to get stuff done. We want to finish things we start. So one of the ideas that I've kind of been thinking about for a while now is, and it's been hard for me, is when I start a book, I want to finish it. Even though I'm like reading it, I'm like, hey, you know what? Like this is good stuff, but it's not something I need right now in my portion of the journey. So I guess like for you, is that something that you've always done? Like, are you able to start and stop a book if you don't feel like you're getting any information that's relevant to you now, or like, what's your thoughts around that?
I've struggled with that. Actually, there was a Dr. Joe Dispenza book about like the mind and all that stuff, all the things that he talks about there. You can look them up, very popular. I struggled to finish that. I'm like, okay, I don't want to not finish it because that kind of creates that habit there of not finishing things. But man, I was struggling through it. I did end up deciding to finish it just because I had so many people recommend the book. But I have had other books. There was another one kind of along the same lines. Oh, it was such a dry
Same.
read. And I realized I am just miserable reading this and I'm really not getting anything out of it. So I did decide to stop it. And so I guess the reason why I finished the one was because I had other people saying it's so good and they're credible people. I felt credible. So I'm like, okay, if they're saying it's good, there's got to be something in here. So I need to just kind of keep going and trudging forward on this. But the other one that it was just one that I picked up. Maybe somebody had recommended it, but I didn't have like tens or hundreds of people saying, oh, it's a good book. You need to read it. I decided to put that down because I realized it wasn't helping me in the grand scheme of things, or at least in the moment. So something also I've done is I figure out what am I struggling with right now. And I've mentioned sales. So I've read a couple of sales books and a couple of marketing books. And so as I'm going through, I'm trying to keep it in the light of what I'm dealing with right now. And I'll earmark pages. I might actually write some stuff down, write some notes somewhere else, and go back and review those. So one of the books I did this with was Take Back Your Time, or not, sorry, not Take Back Your Time. That's a good
Buy
book
back
though.
your time.
Buy Back Your Time. Yeah. But was they asked you answer. And so this was about marketing and how do you create videos and blog posts and all this stuff, essentially creating a huge SEO, search engine optimization for your business and everything. And so I was earmarking all sorts of stuff. And I actually went back and looked through it and I created, and I used Asana for my project management platform. And I put all the things I needed to do from there. So then now I don't have to go back to the book again. I've got it in Asana, and I actually started assigning a task to my VA and everything based on blog posts, this, that, and the other. I created videos. So I now find books that are areas that I need to learn more about or I'm struggling in. So then as I'm going through that, I can think in the lens of what I'm struggling with or whatever, and I can start to implement that. And I found that my reading has been 10 times more effective because of that. And I've retained a lot more rather than Joe Schmo over here recommended this book to me. And it's another business book just talking about basically the same thing as every other one. And while it's
Mm-hmm.
a great read, it doesn't apply to my current life. And so that's what I found to be more helpful. And so if it's not something that's applying to the current life, I kick it back. I'd say, okay, that's on the list to read, but I'm always putting something new that's current for me right now in my life or business that I need to read. And that's kind of how I've worked through it. But to answer your original question, kind of 50-50 on if I'm just going to go ahead and finish it or not. I think it's more a peer pressure than anything if I actually finish it.
Yeah, that makes sense because like it's a struggle for me too because like I know sometimes we can get lazy and like we quit before like we actually get the results from a thing. So same with books. It's like I could be reading it, maybe the beginning's a little dry, stuff like that. And if I quit, I could get that one gold nugget that I could implement in my life that could change everything, right?
Yeah.
And then another thing too is that kind of got me more into, quitting a book in the middle of it if I didn't feel like I was getting value. Like I'll still have it on my shelf. I can always go back to it. But if it's not something I'm working on, because we only get 24 hours in the day. So that's another thing I kind of wanted to talk about is like time management. And I think that's like probably one of the most important pieces of personal development is being able to manage your time effectively. Because like, again, at the end of the day, you see all these people doing these amazing things. And it's like, well, they're human and they still have only 24 hours, right? So it's like they're doing things with their time that maybe I'm not doing because I'm not at that level yet, right? So what kind of things do you do to manage your time effectively?
So I stick with a pretty standard routine, and just any chance I have a little extra time is where I'm trying to throw anything I can into that. But pretty much waking up at the same time, going to bed at the same time, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, really working to make that more solidified instead of staying up later and later and later. But then I have a set time where, I'm doing my stuff in the morning. That's typically where I do a lot of my work is in the morning. And then as I can throughout the day with the full-time job, I have a VA in place to really help out with a lot of these things. Actually, I've got two of them. So that's where a lot of my work ends up getting done because I've put those people in place. I put the systems and the processes there. I've set out the standard operating procedures of what I want done, how I want it done. So they're able to do the work while I don't necessarily have that time, but I can shoot a message back and forth. I can approve certain tasks once they're completed on their end to make sure that it looks good and everything like that. And then I just set up like, okay, from this time to this time when I get home is when I'm going to have family time. And then after that, it's time for me to work on the business for a little bit. And then after that, it's finally some time for my wife and I, and then going to bed essentially. And it's not always the best, but it goes back to what goals do I have? And so, of course, the weekends is kind of where I put in that extra time and everything overall, but I try and have a pretty rigid routine
Right.
through the week. And then the weekends is kind of where I create that flexibility. Do I need to work on more business stuff this weekend, or I might have some family time? And I try and go back and forth. Like one weekend's more business focused, one weekend's more family focused and everything, because I'm building the business for my family. If all I'm doing is the business, then what's the point of building it since I said it was for my family? Then clearly it's just for me. And so really just trying to find that balance overall, or that harmony is it's a struggle day in and day out. But I try and assess that once a week, for sure once a quarter, maybe once a month, where I go and assess and see what that is. But it's all about putting systems in place for myself. And like I've mentioned, I like to use Asana. I put things in there. Okay, am I engaging in these groups? Am I doing this? Am I doing that? And really just making sure I check those off. So it's all going back to checking off tasks and completing things, but setting up the plan ahead of time. And why I do this, and I'll give this analogy, is if you go to the gym and once you get to the gym, you figure out, oh, okay, I'm feeling like doing arms today, and then you do arms, but you didn't say what you were going to do, how many sets, what kind of workouts we're going to do and everything. The workout may still be pretty good, but it can also be pretty bad because it depends on your mood. Because you got to the gym and decided, I'm feeling like arms today. Nobody feels like doing legs. But if you go in with a plan that on Monday, I'm going to do legs and this is the workouts I'm going to do and the reps and all this stuff, the more details you can have, that workout is going to be so much better because you had it planned out and you put a plan together. So now you have to stick to that plan. Otherwise, you're going against your word. But when you're in the moment, making the plan in the moment and going based off feeling, you don't actually do as much because I'm not feeling that. Oh, you know what? Yeah, my knee's kind of bothering me. So I'm not going to go quite as hard on squats or whatever it is because of that feeling. And so setting up plans ahead of time helps us actually be more effective overall. And so that's really how I manage my time and make sure that I'm moving forward on the tasks that I need to move forward on, is really creating a plan ahead of time and allowing some flexibility there on the weekends.
That makes a lot of sense because I'm the same kind of way. Like before, I used to be the kind of person who would just shoot it from the hip. I wouldn't have a set wake up time, not a set bedtime. I'd just roll out of bed and just do whatever came my way. Right. But what I've learned is if I have more direction about what I'm doing, then those things tend to get done.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel like a lot of people are kind of missing that. And it's like, like a lot of people have the perfectionism. So it's like you're going to set out your day. It's not going to go exactly perfect because, as we all know, life isn't just some perfect thing that everything you plan, it happens just that way, right? So you have to be kind of open to going a little bit off plan sometimes, but like things like workouts and stuff like that. Um, if you actually plan what you're doing, well, first of all, you can get in and you know exactly what needs to get done and how you need to do it. And you don't need to spend any time thinking or anything like that, right? Because like at the end of the day, when we're setting up our schedule, we're two different people. We're the person that's planning ahead, and so our mindset's going to be different than when we're actually in the moment going through it, right? Because so if you live by integrity by doing what you say you're going to do and you plan ahead, you're more likely to stick to the plan. And then if it's planned, then you know what you're distracted from as well, right? So like even for me, the hardest part of my day is the morning because I'm all groggy, stuff like that. So I make sure without any fault to plan my morning. My afternoon's a little more open, but I still have like a general sense of what I'm going to do. But then by that time, people are awake. You have other people like wanting some of your time. So I do have a little more flexibility there. Um, but I think I would be doing my audience a disservice if we didn't talk a little bit about public speaking and communication, because a little bit selfish here myself, but that's what I'm working on a lot too. And I think like, especially like in the sobriety community and like people getting sober, if you're able to articulate yourself in a certain way, you'll get more people on board to, you know, maybe not start drinking or not continue drinking and like think maybe in the back of their head, oh, maybe I do have a problem. Right. So I think it's super important for people to kind of know how to communicate. So I guess if you could look back to when you started like your public speaking, that kind of thing, your communication, like how did you start and what would you say the best way to start now after going through it would be?
The best way to really start is by posting on social media, like just starting to do videos, getting comfortable and confident on camera, because a lot of that will translate out to the real world, especially podcasts. If you have a good message that you can share, if you have value, which we all have some kind of value, some kind of good message we can share, getting on podcast is, to me, overall, like the best thing that you can do from a conversational perspective, because you learn how to take your information that's in your head and answer it, to put it on a podcast and also answer questions, because a podcast is about the closest thing you're going to get to, especially a conversational one like this. That's not just, hey, answer one or question one, answer one, question two, answer two, and not super canned podcasts like there are some out there, but one that's more of a natural conversation. It's going to allow you to understand how to actually communicate with people and learn how to give a story, to give some details, to go into detail and expand upon an idea through podcasting. So videos and podcasting would be the first routes that I would say to do. And then third, just start talking to people. The more you do something, the better you're going to get at it. And so these are all three fairly inexpensive or free ways. Podcasting, depending on the platforms you do, may be free, may cost a little bit, but they're all relatively cheap for you to actually start communicating. And so we really have to build up that muscle. So that would be the first thing that I would do. The second thing there, like that group being the first thing, the second thing would be figure out a message that you want to share. What's something that's important to you, and then something you've been through. If you want to start talking about building a $1 billion business, but you've never built a $1 billion business, it's kind of difficult to teach somebody that. One, because you don't know what you're doing, but two, nobody's going to listen to you because you've never built a $1 billion business. So you need to speak on things that you have done, that you've been through before, which goes to number three, having your story. Your story is your core message. So go back and look at the things that you've done, the things that you want to share about, and create a story, a persona of you, and that will help people want to follow you. And of course, there's people that aren't going to want to follow you. Just going around sobriety and everything. So somebody like me who hasn't went through that sobriety, well, I'm going to respect the person that's going through sobriety. For me, I'm not going to necessarily connect with that because I didn't have to go through that. I had already made that decision. And so for me, to be frank, it's not a big deal for me. Now, I understand it's a big deal for other people, but it's not for me. So I'm not going to be like, oh man, that's awesome. I'm going to follow this guy because of his sobriety. But somebody that's going through that right now and they're on day 2 or day 3 or day 365, and you're 10 years into that sobriety journey, they're going to want to follow you and see what you did, the struggles that you had. And so you can talk to that and connect to those people that are not as far along on that journey in their sobriety. And so whatever your story is, your background, you can teach somebody. And so kind of a general rule of thumb that a lot of people talk about is talking to your 2 or 3 year former self. You can talk about that journey that you were on 2 or 3 years ago. Where you're at now versus 2 or 3 years ago is a great way to start. So thinking about what was it that, where are you at now and where were you at 2 or 3 years ago? And what do you wish that 2 or 3 year younger version of yourself knew on this journey? Kind of like you talked about what, me, when I first got into speaking versus now, perfect question to ask yourself for whatever it is in life or the message that you want to start sharing. What do I wish I knew 2 or 3 years ago? And that's where you can get started on that third portion of this. So do podcasts, do, Facebook videos, whatever social media platform you want, just videos on your phone, whether you post them or not, just get started taking that action, really figure out what kind of message you want to share, and then building the story are the 3 things that I would suggest for you to do to get started with speaking, with learning to communicate better.
That's awesome. And that's good news because that's kind of what I'm doing now. Like I've done the podcast, like I was nervous about it. I didn't want to do it, but at the end of the day, I know that just taking action is the first thing you need to do. Don't worry about the particulars. Like you're going to suck in the beginning. You have to be comfortable with that. And then I started doing social media content, reels, that kind of thing. And then you just get your mind in a different space when you're doing that. And you're like actually creating different content and thinking back to like, for me, for example, when I first started getting sober, what would those people need to hear or want to hear from me, right? And I think the third piece you spoke about was the story. I think that's probably the part that I'm struggling with most. And I only think because like when I'm going to tell my story, like with most people, right? Like life is super complex and there's so many different things that happen in your life. Like you're kind of trying to think like, okay, which stories do I need to bring up? And like, how do I want to explain it? Right. Because it's hard to do. And it's like just thinking at a high level, it's like, oh, I could just tell my story. But then when you go and sit down and actually try to write it out and stuff like that, like you're like, okay, this is a lot harder than I thought it would be. But do you have any maybe tips for me and the people listening of like different ways that you can go about like developing your story and being able to present it in a way that like would make more impact on people?
Yeah, it's all about who your audience is. So, for the example, when I talked about drinking, and I mentioned very vaguely about how it made me want to do things that I didn't necessarily do before I got into drinking my freshman year of college. And what that was, and it was me wanting just to get laid, like just random girl that I just met at the party and let's hook up kind of thing. Now, I share that with you because this is probably an audience of adults. If I was talking to kids, I would not bring up getting laid, especially if I was talking to an elementary school, like going into an elementary school. Worst thing I could do, possibly. But I know that because of the audience, I won't share that detail. I'll say there was things like bad things or whatever that I didn't. I changed into a different person when I started drinking, and that this is my personal experience. And here's why you shouldn't drink. Blah blah blah. But when it's adults and especially men, like, hey, I'm just going to say it. I'm going to lay it right out there because they're adults, they're men. They're going to relate with that and understand that. And they're at a level that they can handle that kind of conversation. And it's not a weird thing to bring up. So, really focusing in on who your audience is will help you figure out what parts of your story are that you should share. So really, it just comes down to, what's this idea of the story overall, and then those details get filled in based on who that audience is, and of course, these specific parts of the message that you want to share as well. Because if we go back to sobriety, this is huge thing. Okay, what about sobriety? Am I going to talk about the struggles? Am I going to talk about the triumphs? Am I just being motivational and encouraging to other people, or am I trying to give the reality behind that? What's my core message, and then who is my audience will really help me be able to understand what parts of my personal story I can share. Because you're right. I mean, great question. That there's so much that you could share. So knowing what message you want to have come across and then who your audience is are the two things that you really need to look at before you quote unquote develop out that story for that speech.
That makes a lot of sense. And like I was just kind of thinking now as you were talking, it's like it's like what I guess the whole thing what we've been talking about is like taking action and like actually having conversations and actually telling my story because then I can tell it and then get feedback from people because that's another thing that I think is super important. It's like a lot of people are slipping on, especially when you own a business, stuff like that. I listened to some guys talking about they started a blanket company and it's called Hush. It's a pretty big brand here in Canada. I'm not sure if it went global or whatever, but they made a bunch of money right off the bat. They had these weighted blankets, but it was because winter. And then when summer came, all their sales dropped to zero. And so what
Mm.
they ended up doing is they reached out to all their customers and they ended up getting feedback from them all. And they found out that, hey, this blanket's awesome, but I'm sweating like crazy. And then they're like, oh, okay. And so they got a bunch of feedback. So they ended up developing the same kind of blanket, but that kept people cool as well. So I guess like what do you think about like feedback and like how important has it been for you, like growing your business and developing as a person?
It's super important, but at the same time, it's detrimental to the business as well. I've been guilty of just listening to everybody, and everybody has their own opinion, and they don't have all the information. So you need to be selective on who you allow to give you feedback. I've had people give me feedback on things, and I'm like, okay, like that doesn't even make any sense, or that's not exactly what I meant by that. And so you kind of have to take some of that feedback with a grain of salt. Be thankful that the person was willing to give you the feedback, but I would be selective on who you get that feedback from. And so, a good rule of thumb for me is, are they somewhere that I want to be in my journey? Uh, if they're a divorced person 3 times over, I probably don't want to get marriage advice from them. So if they start telling me, hey, if you should do this, that, and the other in your marriage, or your wife should be doing this, don't. Okay, yeah, yeah. Thank you for telling me that. I'll be kind, but I'm gonna let that go in one year and out the other, or I'll filter through it. Like, is that something kind of valid? Because everybody does have some kind of advice, but you got to look at that source and their credibility behind that as well. So somebody in that situation, I might think about that. And if I can see where, yeah, you know what, that actually would improve my marriage, I'll implement it. Otherwise, just go on, thank you for the advice and everything. So I just am really selective about who I take advice in from and really actually take that to heart, because if you just allow everybody to say something, you're going to be continuing to change up your process, how you do things. Your business is going to continue to change. And guess what? The business is going to go downhill because that person probably isn't going to be a customer anyways. And I think that's the biggest thing I've learned is that I'll say, oh, hey, this would be cool if you did this with your business. I mean, public speaking coaching, super broad. That could go into any area. And at first I was, oh, yeah, this would be cool. That'd be cool. Well, until I get some money in hand from you that you're going to pay me for this product or this service, uh, that's great. Cool. I'm just going to stay on my path unless it's somebody that I trust as a trusted advisor giving me advice and feedback. Now, if it's actually on my product, like in this case, and a lot of people are like, hey, the blanket's making me sweat. I'm a sweat hog in this thing. Hey, okay, maybe we should come up with something that doesn't make people sweat. Let's come up with a cooling blanket and everything. So great on that. So there's that caveat too. If you have 10 or 20 people telling you the same thing, it's probably something needed to change or something you keep doing if it's a positive thing. There is that little caveat in there, but I tend to only allow certain people to actually give me that feedback that I'll actually then end up dictating what I do with my business.
That makes a lot of sense. And because like just like you said, if you're talking to somebody who's been divorced 3 times, that's probably not the right person that you want to get advice from. Like I believe that you learn the most from your failures, but it's obvious that that person's making the same mistakes over and over. Which kind of brings me to my next question about critical thinking, because that's something that I think a lot of people don't have these days. And
Yeah.
then there's another thing that I've kind of been looking into. It's called the Solomon paradox, where people are better at giving information than or giving information than using it themselves. And so just thinking around that, um, what are your thoughts around that? Because it's like at the end of the day, most of us know what we need to be doing. Like if we're going on a diet or something like that, then it's like eat less and move more is basically the fundamental formula. But what are your thoughts around critical thinking and people giving advice?
Yeah, I think critical thinking, we don't have hardly any of that at all. And I want to answer the second part first. First of all, Alex Hormozy he's talked about this several times in his podcast, The Game. I don't know what episode, but I'm sure you could probably find stuff where he talks about this. And he likes to put himself in a third person perspective because he has all the information, he has all the background on himself, so he can give himself that advice. And I can't help but think about, especially when I was in the dating world where I had my guy pals and be like, hey man, what do you think about what do you think I should respond to this girl with? And they would give some great advice, and vice versa. I'd give them great advice. But when it was my turn to respond to the girl I'm trying to talk to and hit on, like I don't know what to say. So trying to put yourself in that third person perspective and really think about ahead of time as well is what I would do. Going back to the gym, if I make a plan ahead of time, I can see what works and what doesn't work. So trying to plan ahead and think about where you're trying to go, that end in mind is what I would say in order to give you advice. Is this going to move me in that direction? And we can go back to the food analogy. If I'm trying to get a six pack and my spouse or somebody says, hey, you want to go out and get Chick-fil-A, or hey, you want to go get ice cream tonight? And I think about my goal of getting a six pack, then it's not an easy decision, but based on logic, it's an easy decision. Ice cream will not get me towards my six pack. So no, or Chick-fil-A either. But if I'm not thinking about the end goal in mind, then oh, I had a hard week. All these things are justified there. So really trying to get outside of yourself and look at that big picture and make that micro decision for the macro level is what I would suggest to do from that Solomon's paradox there. As far as critical thinking goes, I don't really have a good answer for that. I mean, I think just people want things instantaneously and they want the least path of resistance. And so a lot of times not having to think through things, just making a decision in the moment based on that micro decision, which I guess really can go back to the Chick-fil-A or ice cream analogy. I don't like to think about it. So I'm just going to do this, and I'm not going to think about big picture, long term, what that is. But those that critically think, I really feel like are going the furthest in life, that they are the best leaders out there, whether it be just their family, whether it be just themselves, whatever kind of leader that is. If you can critically think through things, you are going to be able to change your life for sure, because you're now thinking through multiple steps. It's kind of like playing checkers versus chess.
Yeah, that's great. I guess another question I had for you, and this is kind of something that I've thought a lot about too, is like, what do you think the like best skills that a person could be focusing on, like especially in this day and age?
Communication, and that's not just because I do public speaking, but communication. I really believe 90 to 95% of all issues come down to communication. And we talk a lot, but we don't communicate. Talking is just saying some stuff, throwing it, trying to, shotgun blast it out there, hoping something sticks. Communicating is all about being clear and concise on your message and then sticking to that. The next one I would say would be leadership. We don't have enough leaders. We don't have enough people actually taking responsibility and then also leading people, literally saying, hey, here's where we're going, which really goes back to communication. A good leader will communicate a very clear vision, a very clear path, will hold people accountable for the things, and won't be afraid of hurting somebody's feelings because they held them accountable to it, or they said some tough love or the hard truth. They just communicate clear and concisely. So to me, communication is the best skill that anybody can learn and pick up, and that'll take you so much further in life and in business than anything else.
I 100% agree with you on that one, and I definitely saw that in myself that my communication skills weren't where I wanted them to be. So that's why I like kind of dived in. I started the podcast. I started doing content online, all that kind of stuff. Like having these conversations with like people like you, that kind of thing. Like I'm new to it, but it's definitely something that I can see that I'm getting so much value from, because it's like where I'm living now, like I don't have too many friends in my area. I live in a small town. I'm working on a bunch of stuff, which is like I kind of keep to myself, because I'm like, that's all I'm doing right at this moment in my journey, is just focusing on hammering down on the things I'm working on now, so I can be able to have more time later to do all the things that like I would want to do, like different hobbies and stuff. But at the end of the day, it's like all the stuff I'm doing is like stuff that I enjoy, stuff like that. Like some people might say it's boring or whatever, but like I get up every single day like knowing that I could potentially help somebody with having conversations like this or whatever. Because I know when I was in my darkest days, like it was, as weird as it might sound, it was like podcasts and stuff like that where I was able to pick out um a nugget here or a nugget there that got me through that dark moment. Because there's been so many times, even just in my sobriety journey, where I almost fell back into old habit patterns of just running away from my life and drinking instead of, facing struggles head on. But I guess we're coming up close to the hour here. I want to be respectful of your time, but what were some of your final thoughts that you had about like personal development, how somebody could better themselves in life?
Stick to something. That's one thing I found early in my life, and especially my self-development journey, that I would hop from thing to thing to thing, and I would never actually get good at it, or never spend enough time on it that I can figure out what I actually needed to fix, what I actually liked. Because for me, I've always struggled with, if I can't quite figure it out, it really bothers me, and it makes me, I just kind of want to move on to something else rather than continuing to work through it and figure it out. Like I want to accomplish it. And yeah, I like to have a little bit of struggle. I don't want to just be super easy, but it was hard for me to continue to try and do something to actually achieve it and be successful at it. But when I started focusing in on the journey rather than that end destination, is where things really changed for me. So really stick with something and focus in on that journey. If you don't focus on the journey and you only focus on getting to the end destination, it's going to suck every single time. Nobody likes running, but think about running a mile or 1 kilometer, for those of you that well, Canada, yeah, Canada does kilometers. So if you're trying to run 1 kilometer, and if you're just thinking about, man, I'm out at 1 kilometer, the whole way, you're going to be freaking miserable, more miserable than you already are, because you're running in this hot weather right now here in the summer. But if you just focus on like, man, I'm out here, I'm getting to breathe, I'm really exercising, making myself healthy, like being active. I have 2 legs to be able to run, like all these things that you could focus on as you're going through this journey of the 1 kilometer run, you're going to be more happy. You're going to enjoy it more. And then when you do get to 1 kilometer, you're like, man, that was awesome. I feel great. I accomplished what I wanted to do. Instead of the whole time you're like, I'm not at 1 kilometer, I'm not at 1 kilometer, I'm not at 1 kilometer, it's gonna suck. So focus in on that journey and stick with one thing, because it's gonna take you a long time either way, but it's gonna take even longer if you continue to hop from thing to thing to thing.
I think that's an excellent message, because I know in my life, like especially starting entrepreneurship, stuff like that, you'll get shiny object syndrome, and you'll be jumping around before you make anything um, actually successful. And it's like success is like that curve. It's like it doesn't start big and then it goes up like that, and people tend to quit before they actually see that success. So
Yeah.
I'm definitely, I learned that the hard way, but I've actually learned it. So I'm focusing on one thing, and if anything comes my way, like so many times, like, oh, that sounds good, I want to try it, but it's like, no, 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 no. We've been there. We know what that means. Stick to what with one thing, so you can actually develop some skills there and make it work, right? So, but I guess we'll end with like, where can people find you, follow you? You have social media, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm all over social media. Facebook and LinkedIn are probably my primary location. So Facebook is The Real Philip Sessions. LinkedIn is Philip Sessions with 1 L in both of those. And then my website is speakingsessions.com.
I love that. Speaking sessions, that's awesome. But it was awesome having you on. I really appreciate that. Like I thought we had a good conversation and a lot of people can get a lot of value out of this. But yeah, no, it was a good conversation and thanks a lot for your time.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on, and amazing host, by the way.
Cheers, brother. I appreciate that.